Welcome back, everybody, and you are listening to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul, and this is the Adam Messer Show, and I'm your host, Adam Messer, and this is our second hour today. Our special guest today is Dacre Stoker, so if you're just now tuning in, Dacre Stoker, yes, that name sounds familiar. Because of Bram Stoker. He is actually Bram Stoker's great grandnephew, and the first hour we've been talking a lot about just different kind of historical values with Dracula. So, Dacre, thank you so much for being with us again today.
Adam, it's my pleasure. I can go on and on for hours, and sometimes I need these outlets with interested folks like yourself and your listeners who want to tap into all things Dracula. So, where do you want to pick up now? We've had a great first hour. What would you like to get going with in the second hour?
Well, I love the fact that you know so much about Bram. Can we dig a little bit more into? Obviously, it's a family relation. You probably grew up, but can you talk about your backstory with that? Because as a kid growing up, imagine you probably didn't, I mean, I could only imagine it was like, oh, Dracula, with some relation, or was it like, oh yeah, it's Dracula, what was that like growing up?
That's one of the questions I get asked the most, and it's one of these things I can't dismiss, but it's sort of strange, and I occasionally I do meet people who are descendants of famous folks, and probably about 80% of the time their lives were not really affected, or they were guarded against the outside influences of their famous relative. Now, to put mine in perspective, Bram was one of 7 children.
Big
it was
family.
His youngest brother, George Stoker, who I was directly related to. He was my great-grandfather. And George and Bram were actually very close. George actually lived with Bram for a while when George was doing his medical training in London and helping out Bram, being the doctor for the actors and actresses in the Lyceum Theatre. But I was born in 58, lived in Montreal, Canada, and it really wasn't until the late 60s, early 70s that many people in outside the scholarly world knew much about Bram Stoker. They knew Dracula.
Right.
1897, the book was written. In the 20s, it starts hitting the stage. In the early 30s, it's on the movies. It's reaching this incredible pinnacle with Bela Lugosi in the 30s and Christopher Lee in the late 40s and 50s and early 60s. And then there's a bit of a hiatus, but it comes back with Stephen King and Anne Rice, and then, of course, Francis Ford Coppola in the 90s. And that's super condensed because, folks, there's like over 300 films with Dracula being a major character, and it's spread on that time frame. But the Stoker family really didn't have anybody that knew much about Bram. He had a son and had a daughter, and those cousins of mine are still living. They're retired chartered accountants in their 70s, and they certainly are very appreciative of what Bram did, and they have some cool papers and journals and medals and cool stuff. But they didn't really dig into Bram like I did, so there wasn't really much of a family pipeline, so to speak, for me to connect with, to learn as much as I have now.
Mm-hmm.
I learned an awful lot when my father, when I was like 12 years old, and people would joke around Halloween, what's going to happen at the Stoker household? Are you going to take our blood or give us candy? And they're like, okay, well, Dad, what's that all about? And he, I'll never forget the day he took that mustard-colored book off the bookshelf and opened it up, and Adam, it was a first edition of Dracula signed by Bram to his mother. I mean, this book is probably worth, $250,000
Wow.
today. And he opens it up and says, well, one day you need to read this, son. And, I sort of looked through it a little bit, and it was very hard to read, especially for a, 12 or 13-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And I fast forward to university when I was taking an English course and was needed to do an English paper on some author. I just said, now's the time, and went to the library, and there was actually a book by two Boston College professors, McNally and Florescu, who wrote In Search of Dracula. Mm. And the more times I mentioned that book at conventions all over the world, people go, yeah, we know that book. It was a huge seller. And it was the first one that connected Vlad the Impaler to Bram Stoker and his Count Dracula. And that's kind of critical, because these guys also lucked out in a huge way. They went to the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, where there was a woodcut, and a woodcut is what was used back in the 1700s to press paper on and drag ink over, and it was essentially making early newspaper. Mm-hmm. That would be essentially education. And people didn't read very well generally that much, but they could certainly look at pictures. Mm-hmm. And this woodcut was one that many Vlad the Impaler and Dracula fans look at to this day. And it's a picture of Vlad sitting at a table and these bodies impaled all around them. And he's eating parts of these bodies with a big bowl of blood in front of him. And McNally and Florescu looked at this, and they found this poem in the German courts from Mikhail Beheim, and it talks about Vlad Dracula being such a horrible, cruel warrior and leader that he actually drank the blood of his enemies. And it turns out that was not actually an accurate translation, Adam. It was that he put his fingers in the bowl of the blood of his enemies when they were impaled or beheaded, as sort of a way to sort of belittle the power of your enemy. But nonetheless, that's where I learned about my famous relative, and I learned the world's reaction to him. It was like, okay, this is pretty neat. I've got this relative who wrote this book that's pretty famous, and some movies, adapted. But as I started reading more, now that spurred me on to look at some other books, other biographies. It's like, wow, a lot of other people in the world are interested in what my great-granduncle did. Mm-hmm. And that was impressive. But it didn't affect my life, because at that time I was in university, going to school and taking courses so I could become a physical education teacher. But I was also training for the Olympic Games in 1980 at the time in the sport of modern pentathlon, which meant running, swimming, shooting, fencing, and riding horses. So I had no time for horror or anything else than my schoolwork or doing 3 to 4 sports a day. Yeah. So I was aware, and I did have an uncle that did collect letters and papers and things from George Stoker, our great-grandfather, but none of them really knew more than I became the family official, really, in Dracula. And then we fast forward to 2003 when Ian Holt contacts me, and a long story about that he's got this screenplay that never went anywhere, and he wants a member of the Stoker family to do some research about Bram and introduce him into the story, and let's turn the screenplay into a book. And that took about 5 years. That was the genesis to Dracula the Un-Dead, Adam, which I think you and I chatted about. That's the continuation of Dracula 25 years after the story ended. And that's how I really got my feet, let's say my waist deep, into the world of Dracula studies, when I learned to go to the Rosenbach and look at the notes, and go to the different archives at Trinity College and start looking at, seriously digging into things. Because when you put yourself on the line and need to write a book, and you're a member of the Stoker family with big shoes to fill, you darn well better have your facts straight and get everything right, especially characterizing, my famous relative properly. Yeah. I had a big responsibility within the family to do so.
Well, I think you've done an excellent job. I mean, like this last year that I met you, and just a brief, if you missed the first hour, everybody, I met Dacre last year when he came here for the Savannah Book Festival, when you had your new book that you co-authored with J.D. Barker called Dracul, which is the prelude it's a prelude novel to Dracula, everybody. But since then, and we connected on Facebook, and since then, I read all these different things that you put out. Like I think about a month ago, you put out Bram's a obituary that one of his friends had written. And you just have discovered so many different things, but not just discovered them. You've also collected. You've created like this. I don't know, almost a library of different resources and things that you've discovered researching about your relative. And that's one of the things I think is fascinating. Like I said last hour, I find the history part of it just as fascinating as like the fiction part. Actually, I find the history part more exciting. I'm a big nonfiction guy, so I love nonfiction stuff. But I think it's really interesting how you have pieced all of this together and kind of just made this tapestry of like what was going on and how these different factors played into the writing, and I think it's very interesting the way that you do that. And then you also like the presentation that you do, the Stoker on Stoker, the interviews that you do. You as an author yourself, you've got a couple of different international best-selling books. You have mentioned Dracula the Un-Dead. Dracul was also another one, and then actually, this is one of the things you sent to me, but talking about the research and all that, Bram Stoker's Lost Journal. Can you tell us about that? Because that's that's kind of like a whole little gold mine of like.
It is, and I'm glad you appreciate it. And I first want to make sure that you know this, Adam, and your listeners. My wife actually takes a lot of the info that I find, and I don't always discover this. I become friends with other authors who are sometimes more acclaimed in this field than I am, but I ask them, could I put your work on my website or on my Facebook page, giving you proper credit for it? We like to be a repository. That's another role I feel that as a Stoker I should do. And so the bramstokerestate.org website, my wife and my son, who's a PhD student at University of South Carolina, they help put all that stuff on there, and we encourage other authors, researchers, and it's amazing how often we get emails from people who are trying to write a book or doing a documentary or something related to horror, vampires, or Bram Stoker, and we've got something they can use on the bramstokerestate.org. And one of those things, I came about in a strange but roundabout way, and you've asked about the Lost Journal, so here goes. When I was researching for the first book, Dracula the Un-Dead, I needed to essentially, and I use the term, get inside Bram's head. And up until this point, there was no way to do that other than read the other biographies other people have written about Bram, and that's pretty good. But you don't get inside Bram's head, you get inside the biographer's head, and some do better jobs than others. Some do a lot of speculative stuff, a lot of statements that they think would have come out of Bram's mouth. But I've been a school teacher for 25 years and a coach. And the best way to understand somebody is to, hang out with them for a while, do something with them, like, go on a camping trip or go on some sort of a event that involves danger so the truth comes out. In Bram's case, I couldn't do it, but one of his cousins had something almost as good as going on a trip with Bram, and he had in a box in his attic in the Isle of Wight a journal that Bram kept for 11 years while he was a student at Trinity College, and then, before he was a student, then a student, and then while he was working in Dublin Castle, which was as a clerk in Petty Sessions legal department, and then when he moved to Irving. So this was a very important part of his life that Bram recorded 311 entries and jotted them down in this book. Now, not to be confused with a diary. It wasn't dated and saying, World Dracula Day on the 26th, got to, pay homage to Dracula and drink a toast and have the book in my hand.
Right.
But it was something that someone like you, Adam, would do, or I would do as an author. You get a cool idea, and it may be in the shower or lying in bed. You jump out of bed and you write it in your book. And then later on, it's like, oh yeah, I got to develop that into a part of the story. Or it's an idea floating around in your head that is a vital connection to a story that you wanted. So I got to see the earliest dated piece of writing that Bram Stoker ever wrote, and it was his observation of people fishing at nighttime with big nets and all the logistics that go with going out in these small boats, rowing out into the bay in Greystones just outside of Dublin, and putting the nets out and not crashing into each other and coming back and taking the nets in and getting the fish out, getting the fish into the nets, into the baskets, all this stuff. And it was Bram's practice at looking at something and recording it. And then there was romantic poetry, there was humor, there was gross stuff, about at a party he was at when everyone was so drunk and vomiting on the ground that they were sliding in the vomit.
Oh gosh.
It was all kinds of wild stuff, as well as really sensitive things that you could tell Bram was aware of, the plights of people drinking too much and abusing their wives, and poor people with not enough food to eat. So it made me believe, Adam, that Bram was very much aware of the world around him and was concerned about it enough to write it down. Other things, and one of the coolest ones, and as I say this, and Adam, I think you've heard it in A Stoker and Stoker, but to the listeners, think about where this might have reappeared later in his life when he started writing another novel. And it was, I once knew a boy who collected so many flies in a bottle that they had no room to die.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, isn't that foreshadowing of Renfield? Just a little bit.
Yeah.
And obviously that line didn't show up in Dracula, but that concept did, of a guy collecting flies, collecting insects, and death and dying and that sort of thing. So finding this journal that my cousins had, the process was really quite interesting. I had actually heard that Paul Murray, who wrote probably one of the best, an Irish author and a diplomat, wrote one of the best and accurate biographies of Bram. He found out about this very late in his writing process and sent an assistant to go look at it. And she said, well, there's some pretty cool stuff in here. The handwriting is terrible. It would take a long time to decipher it. And, mentioned a couple things of it in his book, In the Shadow of Dracula. But at that point, nobody expressed an interest to my cousin Noel Dobbs to actually publish the whole thing. And so when I came around asking them about, I'm working on this book, Dracula the Un-Dead, are you guys interested in showing me more things? Noel pulled out this journal. And I had to ask him to get his granddaughter to take photographs of it and send it to me, because I wasn't about to travel from England back to America with a very, very valuable book in my hands, because I didn't know when I was coming back, and I didn't want to put him in the weird position to say, no, Dacre, this stays in the vault. So Jessica took all these photographs, and it took a while to get these things sent. And because this was back in like 05 or 06, when transferring files on the internet was not great, so they actually had to send them over on CDs. So then I could open them up on my computer and add them. It was like a boy at Christmas times 100 when I would go through these 311 different entries and try to read the writing.
Wow.
It was not easy, but as I did, I became more aware of the gold mine that I had. But I also needed to bring in an expert. And that's one of the things as a coach and a teacher you do normally. You do an awful lot. If something's a little bit over your head, so I brought in Dr. Elizabeth Miller, who was a lady I knew quite well at the time. She's a real Dracula scholar. She's also one of the two people who deciphered the Dracula notes that are in the Rosenbach Museum, because Bram's handwriting is so terrible. It's really, really hard to read the stuff and to put it in perspective. So I then had to get all those DVDs copied and then shipped to her in Toronto. And I sat here on my phone with page one open. She sat there on the other end of the phone with her computer and page one open, and then we'd talk about it and try to figure out what it says. So we essentially, to sort of bring this to a close a little bit, we split up the book and tried to decipher what we could, and certain things we'd go back and forth and compare to the Dracula notes. What does the letter J look like after the letter this and this? It took us about a year to decipher the whole thing. And then it took us another year to each choose which chapters we were going to write and make comments on the different groupings of the entries. And lo and behold, by 2012, the 100th anniversary of Bram's death, we produced to the world Bram Stoker's Lost Journal, The Dublin Years, which was all the entries in italics, so you can read what Bram had to say, not his scribbly handwriting, a couple of images on each chapter and what it really looked like, and then in-depth analysis of all the things that Bram referred to. My wife did a great job finding and finding the footnotes of different people, different places that Bram would reference in this. So it really is a good source if you want to get to know Bram. And so I'll wind this up here, Adam, because as you said, you love your nonfictions, and I'm hoping you got a lot out of that yourself. And having read this, you understand Bram Stoker, a whole lot better as well.
It's interesting that you say that, because I find the psychology of the way that people write very interesting too. And I think the more I talk with you and just kind of feeling it out with it, Bram, when he introduced his characters, and you talked about this last hour, where the introduction or the prelude was kind of like a reality TV type thing. He's like, this is a true story. These are people that I know, that I've known for a long time, and that I trust their word, and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of realism, and that kind of got cut out because of his publisher. They thought maybe it was a little too vivid for the audience at the time or whatever. But the way that he, like the journal entries, the epistolatory, style of Dracula, right?
Yeah.
He was in the theater. He was an actor. He was a manager. He knew people. And the more that I listen to you and watch these different things that you share, he seemed like he could have been like a sociologist or a psychologist himself. Almost like, this is, he was into all these different things. Like you'd sent over, he was interested in, spiritualism, philosophical, society, the Whitman, pantheism. He had all these different facets of life. He was an athlete, even in the journals, entries you were talking about, like different stuff, humor, there's some gross stuff. There was, cultural observations. I feel like that is such an interesting way for an author to connect with the reader, because if your characters are believable, it creates such a different dynamic realism for it. I think that's
that great depth. I mean, when you write your stuff and I do the same. I'm not sure what your tactics are, but I like to create a full characterization, just sort of as I've been able to do with Bram, about this is how this guy's wired. And so I have a good idea when I write not only what the guy's going to say, but why. And that's the why is he saying this? So when I've got, and of course in Dracul with J.D. Barker, we've got Bram's older brother, Thornley Stoker. I had to do a full characterization of him, read as many letters as I could about Thornley, read articles written about him by other people, read, and it's bizarre, but you learn an awful lot about people when you read obituaries from third parties.
Yeah, yeah.
And maybe it's too late for them, but it tells you a lot. And so I had to understand what Thornley Stoker would say and why. Same thing with Bram's older sister Matilda. She's a major character, both in Bram's life as well as in the novel Dracul. So we needed to really round out these three people to totally understand how they'd act and react consistently throughout the whole book as to the type of people that they were. And I think that's why the book has got so much success, because it reads, I mean, it is fictional, but so much of it is factual. You can really learn a lot about what the characters are in the Stoker family as real people and what they've done, as well as how things lead up to Bram Stoker writing Dracula as a warning to the world that, in fact, vampires are real.
And I don't want to give away the ending, but I like the lap over or the layover with the coordinates that y'all did. I thought that was such a neat tie-in. Everybody listening in, Dracul. Okay, so not to be confused with Dracula. Dracul is the international best-selling book that Dacre Stoker co-authored with a guy named J.D. Barker, and it really, the cadence, the delivery, the tempo of everything about that book, it matches with Dracula. I mean, like everything, it just feels like it really is a true prelude to Dracula. And I feel like now that you've talked more about like, how you studied and really, got in depth with his thinking with his journal and, trying to translate it. You said her name was Dr. Miller?
Yes, Elizabeth Miller.
Yeah. So when you spend all this time, really getting into his mindset and, and I know JD, I know when we talked last year, you were talking, you said that JD studied and listened to like the cadence and, everything with Dracula for such a long time.
I've got to give some credit to JD here, because one of the things he did that was really amazing, and it's how different writers assimilate stuff. JD likes to go for, a walk jog with his dog every day. And so he got a version of Dracula on his phone, headphones on, and go. And for about a month, he would listen and re-listen to Dracula. And he got into, as you say, Adam, the cadence of Bram's writing, and he studied it by listening. I'm more of a visual guy and needed to study the textures and get the feelings. And so the combo of us was great, and it was a real pleasure writing with him. And we decided right from the beginning that it had to be epistolary style. Adam, have you said, and that's one of the pieces of heat I received on Dracula the Un-Dead. How could it be an official sequel? It's not even done in the same style. And quite frankly, back in 2003 when I started this, I wasn't a strong enough co-author to do an epistolary novel. It takes tremendous coordination and a very different style of writing to do it. But when I hunted down JD and got to know him in our Horror Writers Association, I said, JD, here's my story Bible, here's my pitch. I need someone like you to help me do this, and I need it to be written in the epistolary style. And he said, let me get back to you, and it was the next day we had breakfast together, and he said, I'm in. I want to be able to learn how to do this as well. And so that was great, because now not only do we have a good story that tells about Bram's life, him growing up and his brothers and sisters, and certain events that we have twisted, but we've been able to do it in the same way that Bram did his story, which is different. The plot unfolds through the eyes of the different characters as they're telling their story through journal entries and diaries. And then, as in Bram's case in Dracula, funnily enough, Dracula doesn't have to appear that much in person. He's there in essentially the reflection of the comments of the major characters until about 2/3 the way through the story, when he makes, he's very, very much involved. And in our story, our Dracul, our main vampire, is kind of on the edges, and comes in at about the halfway point. But everything comes together nicely because the whole premise of our story is that Bram's life, his childhood illness, is somehow remedied in a supernatural way. And that gives him good reason to believe that vampires are real. And it's always interested me when I say, well, if Bram Stoker knew vampires were real, and he's done a lot of research, and we'll get to that in a little bit about the London Library and all the books that have been discovered there. But if really thought that it was real, what does he do about it? Do you walk into Scotland Yard and say, hey guys, you know, you had Jack the Ripper a couple of years ago, but now you got this guy, Count Dracula, walking around sucking the life out of everybody. They would have probably taken Bram and wrapped him in a straitjacket and put him in the Carfax Abbey Asylum, you know?
Yeah.
And so I always thought that if it was real, what would Bram do? He'd write a story about it, and people would read it, and they'd get the picture, sort of like a veiled type expose.
Yeah, yeah.
So we end the story, Dracul ends right as Bram is going to sit down and start writing Dracula.
I think that was one of the best endings. Like I said, I'm really a nonfiction guy. I used to read a lot of fiction as a kid, read a lot of science fiction, fantasy. I loved fiction as a kid. But as an adult, you know, my background's in business and leadership. And so I've read mostly nonfiction, you know, stuff on self-development and leadership and things like that. And a couple of years ago, when I started wanting to write my own fiction, and we talked about this before, but, you know, I've got a vampire book that I wrote. I've always been inspired by the Dracula, like the Bram Stoker vampire. That not so much that it's, you know, there's not the romanticism in it or whatever, but more of a traditional, I don't want to even say traditional, but more like a, you know, like this person is, you know, so interesting and so fascinating. They have so many different things, you know, going on, you know. And when I read Dracul, and it was one of those books I picked up because I saw you, you know, I met you at the Savannah book festival. And, you know, I thought it was a great book, and I read it. I actually picked up the audiobook and the ebook. So I was reading it. I was, going to work. I was listening to it in my car, and, you know, and I'd read it on my phone at work, and, you know, at home I'd read it, you know, the hardback or whatever. And it just, the story itself kept propelling forward, kept moving forward, and you kept getting this suspense build up. And like you said, it's the perspective of Bram as a child, and like you said, like what would a guy like Bram have done, you know, later on in life if he felt like vampires were real? He would have written a book about it. But because of because of his background in theater, he would have presented it, you know, in a theatrical kind of way. Like, this is a real story. This is true. You know, I've changed some of the names to protect people. You know,
that's right.
You know, right. And what do we have today? I mean, you know, the things that we're like, oh my gosh, look at this. You know, this is so real. I can't believe it. People are, you know, just fascinated by it. You know. So I always think it's fascinating. I think that's like one of the best, as far as vampire books and stories and, you know, things like that. That's one of the best ones that I've read in a long time. And, you know, I like the movies and stuff too. But getting back into reading fiction, I wanted to read the classics. You know, I wanted to read, you know, some of the traditional stuff. That's why I read, you know, Camille and the Vampire or the Vampire or whatever.
Yeah. Because
I wanted to see, okay, what was kind of like a gothic perspective of the vampire? You know, what was the, you know, what was that like if I want to do a Victorian style, you know, vampire? You know what I mean?
Let me ask you this. I've often thought about this. When Carmilla and the Vampire and Varney the Vampire were all written prior to Bram Stoker writing Dracula. The strange thing is that when they were written in the early 1800s, this was not too far removed from the time frames in Europe, the continent, and in England, that people were really having these strange superstitious beliefs that these things were real. So you read this thing now, obviously we're much better educated. The age of enlightenment has come. We understand science better. We understand germ theory. We read these vampire stories, and what I'm hoping is that the reader kind of gets it, can kind of put themselves into that mindset of, okay, I'm reading it at a time when this stuff really could be real. It's just that Bram did it a little bit better when he, mentioned and had the action in these different places in Purfleet and Exeter and the London Zoo and Hampstead Heath and Whitby, of course. All these places where you can walk around to on that day and go, God, run down that corner. Is it Jack the Ripper or is it Count Dracula? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
So how did that weigh on you a little bit, that you're reading this, even though it's 300 years later, that when it was originally written, people were really sort of thinking that was real?
That's a great question. I have always been fascinated with history, and I feel like human beings today are the same intelligence level that they were, 5,000 or 10,000 years ago. Right? Modern human beings, our intelligence level is the same. The only thing that's changed are technology. Our technology's changed. Science, has changed. Basically science is technology, right? Science is theory and technology, and our mindset has changed, but our intelligence has been the same, and so I feel like the thing that's traveled with us over time are our emotions. And when you have that emotion, like, that connection with that real place, for example, with Savannah, we're right across the street from St. John the Baptist Cathedral, right?
Yeah.
You can share a story about a cathedral anywhere in the world, and there are going to be people that are going to have a connection with a cathedral or a church, right? And I feel like you have an author. If you took a guy like Bram and you put him in today's world, he could still produce the same level of storytelling because he was connected with people and emotion. He played off of that fear that people have, that inert fear. We all are afraid of the boogeyman, right?
Sure.
We're all afraid of the dark. I mean, that's just an innate human fear. And it goes back to our primal days when we had to, hunt and gather in tribes, and we had to be together, and like, what's that loud noise? It's like, oh, wait a minute.
Stay around the central fire. Otherwise something in the dark is going to get us.
Yeah. Yeah. And, so a guy like that, tapped into that human, baser instincts and the emotions. And I feel like that is one of the best things about storytelling, with your level of research and accuracy, the historical value of, all of the work that you put in, for decades now, that adds such a different layer than, well, I don't want to knock anybody. I'm not trying to knock anybody, but that adds such a different layer to your storytelling versus a person who is just kind of like, back in the day, they were talking about like a copy of a copy of a copy.
Yeah.
It gets so distorted, when it's like 10 generations a copy that, it doesn't even look anything like the original,
It's watered down. And some of the things that happens is, instead of you developing a real understanding, a texture and a feel for the atmosphere the story's written, you're just getting the action.
Right.
And I mean, Adam, it's kind of like today we look at some movies and they're so full of CGI that you don't get much drama and plot development. But the CGI is incredible. Mm-hmm. That's kind of where I think what you're getting at.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I just love the authenticity that you have with your development, and the you're constantly challenging it and looking at like new ways. Like you said, it's a repository.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
I want to I want to talk a little bit about at some point, and I don't want to be stopped short with other things you want to ask and time breaks. But when you talk about authenticity, one of the coolest things that I've done, and my son came with me to do, was actually, I've been to Romania now 10 times, and Parker's been with me once. And on one of them, we had an incredible sort of discovery to go actually see the place where Bram chose his fictional castle Dracula. So what sort of time do we have to sort of, I probably need about,
we've got about
eight or
we've got about
minutes
15 minutes, so take it away. I'd love to hear this.
Okay. And I'll do that. And if you need to do a station ID, just let me know.
Let's do that right now then.
Okay.
You're listening to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. Dacre, take it away. I definitely want to hear this. This is going to be awesome.
I think you have to, it's a warning to you, Adam, because when you hear this, you're probably going to want to come and do this with me sometime. So that's a disclaimer. Get ready.
All right.
It's been interesting to me to have the opportunity to go to Romania and do something that Bram Stoker didn't do, but go to the places that he referenced in the book, Dracula. Since about 2 years ago, a guy in the London Library, Philip Spedding, discovered all of the 28 books that Bram listed in his resources in his Dracula notes that sit in the Philadelphia Museum called the Rosenbach Museum. Philip found them all in the London Library, and not only the books are there, but 4 of them have maps, and a lot of these books have little notes in the margins, which is a little bit naughty of Bram, but it shows. And since I've been able to analyze these books and take some photos of them, and I now use them in some of my presentations, I know exactly what Bram was looking for when he was reading these sort of guidebooks and accounts of different places different people have gone to, Transylvania, Moldavia, Wallachia. So Bram never went there, but I needed to go. And so I started going there with Hans de Roos, who I mentioned in the first segment was a good researcher. We were going to actually go and do a travel guide together. That never really happened, but we each in our own way, we've sort of developed and found our own way in Romania and the province of Transylvania. I've started actually leading tours over there. And what I do is I now have been well known for this phrase that I coined at a conference that I was paid to come over and do about tourism, is how to properly exploit this stuff. And I call it responsible vampire tourism. And that is,
I like that,
is understanding the differences and the similarities between Vlad the Impaler, who was a very successful ruler back in the day, and also Count Dracula, a fictional creature that Bram created for a novel that has actually eclipsed Vlad the Impaler as far as popular culture, but history-wise, Vlad still has a big reputation. So we go over there, and I use Romanian companies, and we go see these different castles and different birthplaces of Vlad, the different places Bram referenced in the story, the trek that Harker took up to the Borgo Pass. And one of the things that's been missing, that thanks again to Hans de Roos, he actually deciphered the Bram Stoker notes and found the lines of longitude and latitude that, Adam, you referenced a little bit earlier in the show, that we used at the end of Dracul, which is Bram needed to find a place to describe the action in northern Transylvania, ironically right next to what is really on the maps, the Borgo Pass, up near Bukovina, northeastern corner of the country. And Bram had some maps in these books, as I mentioned, and used the longitude and latitude in different rivers and towns to pinpoint what was an old volcano. And this Mount Israel was a place that, I got to go see this place. I've got to somehow get here. So I hired guides through the company that I was doing the Dracula tours with, and I asked my son if he wanted to come with me. And once one of these tours was over, it's normally a 7-day tour, we said goodbye to everybody. They're on their bus to the airplane. We are driven up with our guide 7 hours up to the north of the country and spend the next 3 days up there with our high mountain guide and a couple of other friends of mine who I've got to know over the years, who are hardy souls and ready to go on an adventure. And we hike up this old volcano. Now, this is not rock climbing with ropes and pitons and everything else. It's high mountain hiking, and it's through areas that have been forested. So there's really, really sharp stobs in the ground, and it was a very misty and rainy kind of day. We left early in the morning, and it was knee deep in high mountain grasses, and we had to avoid all these really sharp stobs, the very old ones, but nonetheless, I headed into forested parts of it. So we're in and out of the forest through these kind of washes. We finally, 3 hours later, we got to the top of Mount Israel, and really cool rock formation. And Hans the Roos had been up there years ago and take some pictures. So I knew I was in the right place based on the photos. And even though our GPS wasn't working, the signal up there, we actually had a map and compass the old-fashioned way, and we realized we'd got up here. So we snapped a bunch of photos. It was really cool. We'd made it to the top of where Bram was going to have his castle. And then the tour guide and athletic director me came out saying, guys, we got a problem. Look over here. We've got bad weather rolling in. And if we try to go back down the way we just came up, which was very, very steep and all these sharp stobs, somebody could get hurt. I said, we're now really tired, and we need to go around the top of the cone, the old caldera of this volcano. And the guide said, oh, that's great. I know it's a little bit longer, but if we go around here, there's a high mountain weather station, and I know the guy that works in there because I used to be one of those guys. So we set a course, and we get our map, and we get our compass, and we set a course to go there, and we did. And sort of our 3 hours up is now about 4 hours later. We still haven't reached the road that we want to get to for the high mountain station. And so our guide is saying, ooh, maybe we've miscalculated. Maybe it's a little longer than I thought. So we luckily we saw this old Jeep heading up this road off in the distance. We saw this sort of dust gathering. So we kind of hoofed it to get to this Jeep. And we asked them if they were actually heading in that direction. Is this where the high mountain station is? Because we were thinking, Adam, at this point, we're going to have to spend the night up here. It's getting dark. Bad weather's coming in. I mean, in a really kind of surreal way, we're kind of feeling a little Jonathan Harker-ish on the way to Castle Dracula, and a little bit of vulnerability. So in a way, it's pretty cool. But, when you're up there at the moment, we're cool. Dragging our butts. We're tired. We had lots of water. We had lots of, granola bars and stuff.
You were relatively safe, but it was just uncomfortable, right?
Yeah, that's right. And we get to this place, and we're sort of resigned to the fact that maybe we're going to have to sleep here. And the high mountain weather guy comes out, and he sees his buddy, our guide, and he gives them this unloading on him all this grief for putting these tourists at such danger. What are you doing up there? The weather's bad, and really lays into him. And he says, who we are. It's the Stokers. We're looking for the fictional Castle Dracula. Oh, well then, come on in. I've got a friend coming up here any moment now to deliver cigarettes and Polinka. And Polinka is this plum brandy. So we go in, and we're wet. We're taking off some of our outer clothes, trying to dry off by the one little fire. And sure enough, this guy shows up. And it's just like a scene out of like Crocodile Dundee, where he pulls out this big knife and these couple of bags. Not only does he have cigarettes for the weather guy, he's got Polinka, he's got cheese, he's got bread, and he has this big chunk of white lard that's been smoked. And he starts cutting these up. And of course, everything at this point is being translated. And it's like, who are you guys? What are you doing? And he's really impressed that, my son and I are here, and the other guys are different Romanians. And one guy's a former U.S. Navy SEAL who's retired. And he starts bringing the drinks. Polinka, take shots. And it turned out that the Navy SEAL it doesn't drink anymore, and our guide can't drink because he's really strict over there about drinking and driving. And so it turned out to be me and my son. Every time there was a shot to be done, these guys would touch it to their lips, then hand it to us. We had to drink this plum brandy, which the only way I could manage it was to take a mouthful of the bread and a mouthful of the cheese and then hide this fat lard, like hide it in this like newspaper that I had on my desk because I was trying to be polite, because I knew, and I said, my son, if we were not polite, we were at the mercy of this guy maybe not driving us back to where our car was. And when he showed us on the map, we would have had another 6 miles to walk.
Wow.
At night, with the thunder and lightning storm going on.
Yeah.
So, to sort of wind this thing down, that's how we discovered the place. And it turns out that the guy driving this beat up old Jeep that ended up squeezing all of us in there to take us down, he was the former head of security of the Kalamani National Park. And we were in the Kalamani National Park, and he now owns a really cool bed and breakfast called Casa Razalui, and it's a beautiful place. He said, you must come to my casa tomorrow, and I'll give you a meal. And so we had time to go there in the morning before we had to get back and catch our flights out later in the day. But we forged this long-term friendship, and he said, before you leave, we have to make plans to come back. And he made us all drive with him into the town to see the interpretive center of this national park. And it showed the volcano, and it showed an old sulfur mine. And he also introduced us to his best friend, who is the head of administration of this. And we all pledged, and of course the guy pulled out some more Palinka, and we all drank a shot for we will be back, and I will bring a plaque commemorating this is the location of Bram Stoker's fictional castle Dracula.
Wow.
Here's the lines of longitude and latitude. I will bring the plaque if you guys will create a trail so tourists can follow it. And I said, is there any other way to get up there than the way we came and the long way home? And they said, of course there is. There's a much easier way.
There's a shortcut right over here. It takes 10 minutes. Right.
Well, Adam, you're close. And I would really wind this down. So I go there the next year. Parker can't come back. I bring the plaque, and we go to stay at this guy's wonderful bed and breakfast where we had our first meeting with him. And he knows everybody in the area, and he arranged for an off-road vehicle club to show up and drive us. And at this point, we had national press from all over Romania to come and take shots of a press conference of this partnership between me and the B&B guy, as well as the administrator, and the placing of the plaque. And these guys on the 4x4s brought us up into the park, which was about a 45-minute drive, slowly, and then we get to the near the top, and we walk another 1.5 miles, which is easy, but it's very gradual.
Yeah.
So it paid off that we suffered the hard way and had to drink the Palinka and the fat and get cold and get scared and everything else, because once we then learned the good way, it's a charm. And I'm so excited to bring some people back there at some time, because I'd love to do a trip where I show people Bran Castle is the castle in Brasov that Bram saw in a book that he used to describe the exterior of the castle, but he placed the action in the novel 400 miles to the north in the Borgo Pass. So Bram did use Castle Dracula, but he placed it somewhere else. And funnily enough, he actually used the interior of a castle in Cruden Bay, Scotland, where he spent 13 of his summers in a place called Cruden Bay, and there's Slane's Castle there, and Bram described in chapter 2 the interior of that in his castle next to Mount Israel. So he sort of took 3 places and merged them all together: Cruden Bay, Scotland, Slane's Castle, Bran Castle from Brasov, and now the northeastern part of Transylvania and Mount Israel, just sort of make the pinnacle of where all the action has to be.
I think that's incredible, and I need to get my passport ready then. That's so cool. Dacre, thank you so much for being on the show today. I know we've got like about a minute left, but what's next? I know you were doing something with the BBC.
I'm doing a watch party. I hope you folks, I hope you'll do it. I just did my first watch party for Underworld, and I didn't know even what those things were, but I'm doing one for the BBC Dracula, the one that came out with Claes Bang and written by Moffat and Gaddis, I'm doing on Friday the 5th. So find me on Facebook if you're interested. And we give you a special code. It doesn't cost you anything, but you have to have your own Netflix account. But what's really cool is you watch the first episode, BBC Dracula, and there will be a chat box if you have registered, and you get to make comments or read the comments. And I've got a bunch of my vampire author friends who are going to be making cool comments about the show as we go.
What a treat. I think that is so incredible. Thank you, Dacre, for being on the air with us today. And we'll have this available for the podcast later on, but I just really appreciate you talking with us the last 2 hours. It's been so much fun.
Adam, it's always a pleasure, especially since you're a fellow author. You live close to me. There's so many things we think of in a similar way. And I also love the fact that you organize really good questions, and you love your fiction and you love your nonfiction well, and I appreciate that, and I think we really gel because of that.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Dacre. Everybody, stay tuned.